Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to what has been my series of conversations during the course of this pandemic, virtual chats with leaders and experts all over the world. I'm Raj Kumar. I'm the president, editor-in-chief of Devex, and really excited to be with my friend Steve Feldstein today, who has worn many hats in the development sector. People following along might know you, Steve, from your time as policy director at USAID. You worked at the State Department. But I want to talk to you today in particular about your new book, which I think is highly relevant to people in the Devex community, because so much of what's happening when we think about global development is on the democracy and human rights side of the equation. The book is called The Rise of Digital Repression. And we're going to get into this, but Steve, I just thought maybe by way of kind of getting us kicked off, one of the interesting things happening in global development is pre-pandemic, there was a lot of progress on many of the SDGs. You could say, hey, we're moving in the right direction, with one glaring exception, which is democratization, right? We're moving in the opposite direction on democracy and human rights. And I wonder, you get into this in your book, and I wonder maybe if you can kind of kick us off by thinking about how does the rise of social media, digital tools like facial recognition, how does that connect, if at all, with this growing trend, unfortunate trend around, reduced democracy?
Yeah. Well, thanks. First of all, just thanks again for having me on. It's really a pleasure to speak with you and to talk about the book. It's a nice, if we can't meet in person, this is the next best thing.
Absolutely.
Really, it's a great question to kind of kick off. You're absolutely right. The trend of authoritarian resurgence is a very real one. And, if you look at sort of where things are going politically around the world, since around 2006, which is like a high point when there were more democracies than at any other point historically, we've really been on a kind of slippery slope where there's an increasing amount of countries that are embracing autocratic measures. And so, kind of going hand in hand with that has been a commensurate rise in the use of digital technologies within all realms of politics, both on a positive end in terms of powering democracy movements, but certainly and more recently, which is what my book tries to capture, the use of digital technologies by governments, particularly autocratic leaders, to enhance their methods of control. So I think, a good question, a good starting point is, to what extent are technologies fueling this authoritarian resurgence? And I think that's a tough question to sort of disaggregate. My general viewpoint in the book is that technologies aren't leading the political repression, but that they certainly help to supplement, complement, in some ways they substitute for the repression that occurs, but that ultimately a country has a pre-existing level of repression, and that it then searches for ways in which to enhance, those objectives, and that technologies increasingly provide avenues to allow for a greater level of repression to occur, whether it's via social media or so forth.
One of the points you make in the book, which I thought was fascinating, is that before the end of the Cold War, a lot of the ways repressive regimes, autocratic regimes would change would be a coup. Someone inside the palace would, a junior military officer or someone would lead a little insurrection, take a fragment or a faction of the existing ruler's team and go after the ruler. And that since the end of the Cold War, it's changed. And that actually now the biggest threat are popular movements, people in the streets. And in a way, the digital tools are really effective for addressing that kind of a threat, right? That you can, if you're an autocratic leader and you want to clamp down on the population and make sure they're not coming after you in some way, there's a lot you can do around disinformation. You talk about some real examples in your book, getting people keyed in on incorrect information, getting them to find a new enemy, maybe that isn't you, and to really know who's who, to know who might be going out in the streets to protest against you early before they do it, take kind of preemptive action. So it's kind of scary if you think about what can be done, given that these are the real threats that the rising number of autocrats actually face.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think so many leaders look to Egypt during the Arab Spring as this kind of quintessential example of a government totally caught unawares by the power of social media. And no one wanted to kind of find themselves in that situation subsequently, where, essentially they had not paid attention to and were unaware of this growing public dissatisfaction. And then, almost seemingly overnight, through mass online appeals that were then supplemented in other ways, millions of people ended up on the streets. And before you knew it, you had this longstanding dictator who felt very Mubarak, who felt very secure in his power, ousted. And so, many other countries looked to that and said, wait a second, we need to learn from this experience, and we need to find a better way to monitor what people are saying. And hopefully, if we're doing things correctly, to either coerce or to manipulate public sentiment, so that we can ensure that we don't have fall and have the same fate as Mubarak. So Arab Spring was like almost in many ways sort of this training ground for autocrats to say, why we need to learn the lessons from what occurred and make sure that doesn't happen in our own countries.
And so what are they doing? I mean, you get into a lot of this in real detail in the book. And in particular, thinking, people who are in the Devex community, who are interested in low and middle income countries in particular. I mean, China might be an outlier, or Russia, but thinking about the kind of countries where USAID operates, right? What are those countries doing to use these tools, taking the lessons of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, maybe the wrong kind of lessons, but taking those, what sorts of things are they doing?
Yeah, and so what's really interesting is that, autocratic regimes, there's all sorts of ways, different combinations of techniques that they use. So I'll talk about a few of them that are kind of more prevalent. In countries in particular that are lower capacity, where they don't have a sort of professional command and control structure, security forces that are, technologically advanced, one of the easiest fallbacks is a combination of internet shutdowns and persecution of online influencers or online activists. So you look at places like, take Ethiopia, one of the case studies in my book, but there's other places as well, Cameroon, Sudan, where the idea is, one, break connectivity to sort of take the air out of mass protests that are occurring. Two, find a way to target, harass, arrest, and lock up particular individuals who have large social media followings, who are viewed as key nodes of protest movements. And so that's sort of one very basic way. But then you see kind of one level up in countries like the Philippines and Uganda, different combinations of techniques. So in Uganda, there's both a reliance on Chinese supplied surveillance to keep track of who actually shows up to protests. And there's also the use of spyware to break into opposition communications to understand better who is within a leadership cadre and to then charge them accordingly. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, which is, a weak democracy, but one trending in an autocratic direction, the whole name of the game there is less surveillance or censorship. And there, it's all about disinformation. It's all about sending both a pro-government narrative that, is full of falsehoods, but convinces a large number of people that these are the right policies and this president should be supported, combined with a disinformation campaign to intimidate, harass, and disparage critics of the government, to essentially say whatever you're criticizing Duterte about is because of your own biases and your own opinions, but there's actually no basis, in fact, when it comes to the criticisms that you're spreading about our great president. And that's actually worked fairly well when it comes to.
It really has. Famously, Maria Ressa says, they broke democracy. Facebook broke democracy because of the platform was used to spread that kind of disinformation in the Philippines.
That's right. Yeah, no, and Maria was one of the people I ended up speaking to, and I quote her pretty extensively in the book, particularly in obviously in the Philippines chapter. And it really is an interesting thing, because so much of what we look at when we say digital repression, we think of Chinese or Russian surveillance or censorship equipment. But in fact, in the Philippines, the most important vehicle used to carry out Duterte's disinformation campaign, both in terms of his presidential campaign and then his actual governance, has been Facebook, which is accessed by 97% of Filipinos who are, of appropriate user age. And so if you think about the spread of that particular medium when it comes to access throughout Filipino society, it's massive. And then when you think about how the algorithms themselves have helped to spread the lies and power sort of these hateful messages, it raises really troubling questions about to what extent are platforms like Facebook or Twitter or others that are manipulated by government autocrats, to what extent are they complicit in this overall repressive structure? And that's a tough question for a lot of people to answer.
Right. It's not just the Chinese technologies you point out in your book. There's a lot of American companies, Israeli companies, German, Italian, right, that are part of this. selling their wares to some of these governments who then go and use them for nefarious purposes. I mean, I was impressed and surprised by the story of Uganda. You just mentioned it, but one of the things you talk about is that they spent a significant amount of money, I think north of $100 million, on a facial recognition system. Maybe you can talk a bit more about that and what their intention or maybe current use is of that system.
Sure. Well, in part that related to elections that took place earlier this year, elections that were roundly criticized as being rigged and unfair. But in advance of that, one of the goals of Uganda's security forces was to have in place technology that, in particular, could monitor who was gathering for protests, so that they could identify later on and knock on the doors of people who had participated and charge them and bring them to jail, but also to spread a chilling effect, so that it would be known very clearly to those who would either vote for the opposition, show up to election polls and with the intent to do so, or even show up to opposition rallies, that their livelihoods would be threatened. And so, what's interesting about the facial recognition cameras is there's, I think, a question about to what extent were the cameras themselves able to track to very small detail who was attending where, and to what extent was it a bit of security theater, that as long as people don't know exactly what the government might be, monitoring, they're going to just sort of be wary about trying to show up and to throw in with the opposition. I mean, ultimately, it probably doesn't matter. I mean, as long as the ultimate outcome is securing the rigging of a false election, then the technology has done its job.
Well, and the tech, as you say, might be mostly theater today, but presumably these technologies are getting more advanced and they're going to get cheaper and more ubiquitous. And potentially, if these trends continue, countries, even low-income countries, will have the ability to do these sorts of things if they want to.
Yeah, no, that's right. And also, you got to think as well. I mean, as more and more countries, and more citizens in these countries access and use digital technologies as part of their everyday lives, right? In terms of business transactions, in terms of mobile money, in terms of how they communicate with relatives, these technologies become even more crucial to how societies operate. And so, my general perspective is they're only going to become a more critical aspect of how different types of politicians and leaders think about their governance and political survival strategies in the years ahead.
So what do you think about people in the development community? Because I noticed a lot of the countries you profile are what you might call a donor darling, countries where many development agencies have close partnerships with governments. There are others that are just major recipients of development aid. And I wonder what the implications here are, because what's interesting to me about this kind of digital repression you're talking about is it's in many ways less stark or less shocking than other forms of repression, right? You talk about in the book how there are other forms like going out and very publicly assassinating a leader, right? And that maybe you don't need to do that now using these digital tools. You can do things that are less intense, that are a little less noticeable. They don't make it into the international media as much. But are very effective. And so I wonder what the implications are maybe for people who work in the development sector who are thinking about how to partner with these countries, work with them on broader long-term development objectives, but at the same time might be witnessing these countries sliding deeper and deeper into the use of these digitally repressive technologies.
Yeah. Look, I think there's a real dilemma, honestly. And there are certain countries where I think there are clear decisions that need to be made. So look at a country like Rwanda. Without any question, first of all, Rwanda has remained a development darling despite a pretty horrendous human rights abuses and essentially an authoritarian government that's been firmly entrenched for a number of years under Paul Kagame. In a country like Rwanda, I would say I think hard questions need to be asked by development professionals in terms of what kind of groundwork you're actually laying for the future when you essentially help to empower a clique such as Kagame's that is doing real damage to people's political freedoms. I think it gets trickier in other situations, like Ethiopia, like Bangladesh, like the Philippines, where there are certain local officials and particular sectors like health, where you can really see important benefits that need to accrue, and yet the human rights records of the various leaderships in place are extremely troubling as well. And so to what extent are, development professionals willing to overlook or at least set aside some of these human rights concerns because they are doing life-saving work, and that, extreme poverty is an issue that, will never be solved if we don't sort of work in all sorts of political contexts. I mean, I come at it from a democracy human rights lens where I would say, don't work with those regimes. But I recognize that when you straddle kind of different sectors and disciplines, the answers aren't easy, and that you don't want to see citizens who really have very little to do with the regimes ultimately suffer because of the depredations of their leadership. So it's hard. It's a hard question.
It is a hard dilemma. And what I think your book kind of highlights, or at least for me changes, is a little bit of the equation around that dilemma, because you could have had the same dilemma before these countries were accessing these technologies, right? They were engaging in human rights abuses or repressive techniques, or trying to become more autocratic. And development organizations say, well, but we want to address health issues or nutrition issues at the same time. I completely get that. What's a little different to me, and maybe a little more worrisome, is the idea that there's this slow creep toward the implementation of these digitally repressive technologies, where if you don't stop it soon, if you don't nip it in the bud, maybe a decade later, these become situations that are very, very hard to ever change, to ever get political progress in, because now they really have the ability to surveil every citizen and to know who's doing what, who's saying what, to have total control in a way that many of these lower income countries didn't really have that sense of total control over their citizenry. Is that a legitimate concern to have, or do you think that's kind of hyperbolic?
Well, I would say yes, no. So in certain countries, in Rwanda, let's just continue using that for a second. In Rwanda, I think that's a very legitimate concern. And the reason that's a legitimate concern is that the state of its security forces and its intelligence services, their reach into society, their disciplined nature, their command and control structure make it so that pairing high-tech digital tools alongside what they already are able to do in terms of their existing capabilities make them a very potent force. And so I think in a situation like that, you have to be worried. I think in many other places, look at the DR Congo, look at other countries like that. There's much less of a coherent security apparatus that is able to make actionable the information that's collected. After all, I mean, it's a pretty wide enterprise that's required. You need to have tools that can collect data. You need to be able to then process the data and understand what patterns derive from that. And then you need to act on those patterns and kind of arrest different people and think through different tactics and so forth. And that's not easy to put all together. And so in that sense, I think a lot of low-income countries will continue to struggle, which is a good thing, when it comes to actually having security forces, intelligence agents who can do something with this. So, I think the picture is mixed in that sense, which is probably a positive.
Yeah, that's probably positive. It also does make me wonder, you said earlier that you're a democracy and human rights person, and from that perspective, we might want to do one thing, from a health perspective, another thing. But maybe if you're working in global development on health, or on agriculture, or on economic development, you kind of have to now become a democracy and human rights person too. Maybe these things become integrated in a way. You get into it a bit in the book about how, especially when you think about digital technologies, they're so intertwined with economic growth now. And that some of the trade-off, I think you call it the dictator's dilemma in the book, is this idea, well, you can shut down the internet if you want, but it's going to cost you on the other side. And, I guess I don't hear, at least myself, and maybe you do, I'm curious, in the development sector, a kind of a sophisticated conversation about this issue, about how the rise of these digital surveillance tools, intelligence gathering tools, et cetera, maybe should change the way we operate in other sectors of development. What do you think about that as a way forward?
No, it's a really provocative question, and I think it's something that needs to be thought through more. So I would say a few things. I think first of all, I am seeing a greater awareness occur in development agencies when it comes to what these tools mean. And so, I've been listening in on USA's Democracy and Human Rights Governance, their global conference this week. And while it's not the only thing people are talking about in that context, there is a wide discussion about digital technology. In fact, Samantha Power, the administrator, yesterday highlighted that in her 5 big priorities to think about for USAID's democracy agenda. So in that sense, at least some of the leading development agencies are thinking about what these mean. But because it's still such a nascent, unsettled area, it's hard to jump to kind of mainstreaming and to actually saying, well, in all of the work that we do, from food aid to health to economic growth and so forth, we're now going to think about it through the lens of what these digital technologies can bring. I think we're still in early days when it comes to understanding better how those different tools interact. I mean, the other thing I would say is that, I believe that there's nuance in terms of how you can approach this issue. So for example, I think there's a general understanding that the worse a country's governance is, the more it will prevent that country from accomplishing many of the SDGs in place, right? And so, the thing is, you try to find ways creatively to work with countries that have some bad aspects and some better aspects, like the Philippines. But in other countries, I think, that are so far gone, that are so authoritarian, that's maybe where development professionals can think about drawing a line and saying, this place is too closed, like some of the countries in Central Asia, for example. It's not worth our time because our aid will be co-opted towards a government agenda that will ultimately undermine development outcomes anyway.
You also talk quite a bit in the book about the technology companies themselves and the role that they play. And you say you were a bit surprised because you thought there was kind of the Chinese technologies. I think you mentioned like 18 countries have purchased that tech and are using it. But it's actually a more mixed picture where these countries are using tech from all over the world, including American tech and European tech. And I wonder, and you talk about the role of civil society in pushing back on those companies to get them to change behavior. Is there a role of the development sector in that too, in pushing these tech companies to do something different? What role do you talk a lot about some of the activist groups and certainly journalistic networks and others, but do you see any broader role for development agencies here?
Absolutely, I do. Again, I know that not every development agency is involved in building up civil society and working on governance, independent media issues, but many are, and I think most should be. And so certainly to that end, I've had lots of discussions with FCDO from the UK, from obviously USAID and others. And, a big part of their platforms is to work with, on a politically neutral basis, the building up of grassroots civic activists, civic organizations. And you can leave it up to those organizations to figure out what is the best way to harness their organizational power. What do they care about? Is it political freedoms? Is it the ability to access information? Is it corruption and holding officials to account? But all those issues are interrelated in terms of just kind of having a better understanding and balance between how governments operate and what are the rights and responsibilities that citizens ought to have as well within that structure, within that framework. And I think any development agency that fully ignores that, and I think very few probably, hopefully do, I think any development agency that ignores that is then just undermining its overall approach in terms of how you build up prosperous, sustainable societies that will help alleviate some of the biggest issues of the day, from poverty to disease.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think you're right. There aren't development agencies that fully ignore it, but I do think the model in the past has been to wait for that big incident or big event and then to flex the muscle of the development agency to say, hey, we're going to withhold aid, or we're going to pause this project. And maybe at least one of the things I take away from your book is we don't necessarily want to wait for that big moment, because what we could be seeing is a structural change, an infrastructure change that may be kind of slow and quiet and happen over many years, but that could be very hard to pull back at some stage.
Yeah, no, let me put a finer point on that. I think you're absolutely right. And I think what you're driving toward is the idea that development agencies should be more deliberate about understanding the effect of these technologies, how it relates to development outcomes, and why the political matters to the economic in terms of their work. I fully agree with that. I think, we are kind of in early stages in terms of understanding, the interaction between technologies, politics, and economics in a lot of different countries, which was part of the motivating factor for me to actually write the book. But I think that it will be an absolutely crucial part of how development agencies responsibly enact their work in the coming years, to be much more aware and conscientious and deliberate about the interaction of these different tools. So that I completely agree with, and I hope that's a message that we can continue sending and amplifying.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do get into this quite a bit in the book, but I'm just guessing for people who are following along who work in the NGO sector or work in civil society groups, what are some of the things you're recommending? You got a whole chapter in the book kind of talking about what can you do given the rise of these repressive digital technologies? What can you do about it if you find yourself in that situation?
Right. Well, there's a number of things. I mean, first of all, I think citizens, some of it is just a basic level of journalism and reporting. If you see CCTV cameras that are suddenly sprout up on a road or near a municipal building, citizens ought to ask some very tough questions. What is actually being collected by these cameras? How were they paid for? Did the money that covered them come from from certain budgets, and if so, what was allocated from those budgets? But on a very basic level, looking and being aware and being organized is a first step. A second step is to actually have organizations that have as one of their mandates an oversight and accountability function. To really kind of push back against some of these tactics. And it's not just physical surveillance that you see. It's also questions about, what are government spokespersons saying on Facebook? What kind of messages are they saying? Fact checking the different narratives that come from the government. These are all kind of elements of that aspect. But what I hope to see is many more people like Maria Ressa. Many more people who are independent journalists who don't just accept what governments say as a final word, but push back, probe, criticize, and explore and seek the truth. And to that extent, that's something that any citizen can really do. And that, I think that's an important aspect to this accountability function, particularly at the local level.
As somebody who runs a news organization, I got to say, though, it is kind of arresting when you get to the part of your book toward the back and you've got a chart of many, many countries, dozens of countries, and their technologies they purchased. So many of them are for, monitoring journalists, maybe stopping them at the border, reviewing what they're doing. So the Maria Rezzas of the world, I mean, she's a very brave woman, obviously. It makes journalism a much more dangerous job to be in many places in the world.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. If you look at, what CPJ and some of these other, consortiums, what they say about the state of journalism around the world. I mean, it's very much under duress, and it's under duress because journalists are really pushing back in effective ways. I mean, they are a real line of defense when it comes to governments otherwise running rampant, stealing money, retaining power, and abusing their authority. And so the more journalists are actually effective in having impact, paradoxically, the more their lives end up being at risk. So that's the trade-off. And yet,
you say if the journalism didn't matter, that you wouldn't be seeing these, attacks taking place, right? That it does matter. And I guess it's particular because of the disinformation side of the equation, right? Where governments, you use the example of the Philippines, can put out false information and create a kind of a fake debate in a way. Putting as much fake information as real information into the world, into the societal bloodstream, and then people turn to an independent news organization or an independent journalist they trust to find out, well, what's real, and that's why that person's voice becomes, so particularly important.
Yeah, I mean, look at for example, in Ethiopia and the current conflict taking place in Tigray, right? So there are two things that the government has done in combination with its armed intervention that are directly relevant to this issue. One is they have cut off and continue to cut off internet access in the region. Why have they done that? So that people don't really know what's taking place. It gives cover for abuses to occur. It leads to a fog of war that confuses the issue and makes it unclear exactly what types of atrocities are occurring. It gives them discretion to do bad acts, right? So that's one. Number two, they're increasingly, manipulating social media, sending on false narratives when it comes to what certain, ethnic groups have done, what certain individuals are responsible for, to the point where either people can't distinguish truth from fiction, or are convinced that whatever government line is being put out is the appropriate one. And so that just shows you how relevant the information side of things are in combination with armed conflicts in countries like Ethiopia, but many others as well.
Yeah, I know one of the people following along is asking what happens if there are no more journalists, independent journalists in a country. They talk about Hungary. Um, yeah, what do you do in that case? How should civil society and democratization activists kind of respond?
Right? Or I mean, look at Hong Kong right now. I think just this morning I was listening on NPR. Apple Media has essentially been closed down, and so you can see very clearly in authoritarian states that this is the strategy. I mean, a place like Hungary, there are still options. Hungary is in the EU. There's access to different types of funding available, but it's hard and it's clamping down. And certainly, the mainstream outlets, are increasingly controlled by government cronies. But then in closed authoritarian contexts, countries like Pakistan, certainly China, increasingly in Russia as well, the environment is shrinking. And, there are ways for citizens to fight back, but I'm not going to, I can't pretend it's easy, that there isn't a huge legal apparatus supplemented by a digital technology, a strategy as well that makes it, the environment for journalists really, really hard.
What surprised you the most in reporting this book? And for people following along, Steve spent 3 years reporting on it. You traveled all over the world. You did a lot of research into the scholarship behind it. That comes through in the book, a lot of data analysis. What surprised you as you were looking into this issue?
Yeah, I think the thing that surprised me the most, and this really started to become clear on the different case studies, was just how much local factors were the kind of relevant reasons why certain technologies, certain strategies were being used. I remember coming in and I flew into Thailand as one of my first case studies. And my kind of pre-existing assumption was that there was a really big kind of Chinese motivated digital authoritarian push taking place, and that they were providing all manner of artificial intelligence systems and so forth. And so that the story would be of how China is reshaping Thailand in this authoritarian model. And what I found was something, really the opposite, where the animating push, the motivations on the ground stem from, traditions and authoritarian incentives that the existing monarchy and military leaders already had in place. And that, in fact, what was interesting is there's a lot of wariness in hedging when it came to Chinese influence, that the Thais both recognized the benefits that they could get from certain levels of Chinese technology, but they were also really apprehensive about Chinese influence coming in too much and starting to take away their own autonomy. And so in all these different countries, the notion of individual agency on the ground and the fact that choices are being made by leaders reflecting their own politics and much less reflective of kind of broader geopolitical divisions was something that I thought was really an important lesson.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I know one of the things that came out to me as fascinating in the book is the role of algorithms. And it gets quite a bit of media attention, but I hadn't realized the full extent of it until reading it in your book about how YouTube, for example, changed their algorithm about what videos you see and how much of a massive impact that can actually have. And it does lead me to think the role of big international institutions, the kinds of places where you've worked in the past, the role that they can play in influencing some of these larger platforms, especially around disinformation, and how vital that can be if we want to get ahead of these issues.
Yeah, no, that's right. Again, what's just so interesting is that, I mean, in many countries around the world, I mean, when you look at platforms like Facebook, and the Facebook is the internet, that's because of Facebook, basics and the different ways that it has been able to spread at low to no cost to individuals who otherwise couldn't afford the data charges. That's how they think about the internet. And so for them, when they see different news stories rise up in their feeds, and if those news stories are inflammatory, right, if they're full of falsehoods, it's very difficult if you've never accessed online media before to suddenly be able to parse through and say, that's false, that is not a trusted information source, that one seems like it's true because it's based on X or Y. I mean, that you're making a lot of assumptions that aren't borne out. And so there is a very much higher responsibility, I think.
And the fake news, the stuff that's truly designed as kind of disinformation, it's designed to be viral. I mean, it's designed to be the kind of story that you would want to tell your friends or you would want to share, digitally, because it's shocking, it's surprising. It's not just like a small tweak to some true story. It's designed in a way to really work, and I think that's why the algorithms pick it up, because it's such engaging content.
That's right. Yeah, no, I was listening to a really good Radio Lab episode this week that talks about this whole problem of disinformation. And it's either 6 times or 15 times, but false news travel 6 or 15 times faster than true objective information across the board in the aggregate, looking back, 10 years prior or looking at today. So it is in some ways, it's a biological problem in terms of how we're hardwired to look at novel false news and immediately to send that along versus the real stuff.
Yeah, and people take advantage as kind of a behavioral science approach, right, to getting people to act in the way you want them to act. And now the tools are there to do it. You could have done this in the past, verbally, right, or through a newspaper, but the tools are just so much more powerful now to do it. And I think that's why your book makes a really big contribution. I know we're kind of up on time. We've got to close out here, but I really recommend your book if people are interested in this topic, The Rise of Digital Repression, How Technology is Reshaping Power, Politics, and Resistance by Steve Feldstein, because I think if you want to understand, like at a deeper level, the issue, the book really breaks it down and kind of takes you through not just what is digital repression, but what is repression, first of all, like understanding, how do autocracies kind of grow and assume power, and then where does digital now fit into that approach that's ages old, and then what do you do about it, which is not an easy, as you say in our conversation today, not an easy answer.
Yeah, well, thank you again. It's it was an issue that I've thought for a long time about, and what I really try to do in particular is to incorporate different perspectives. I think so much of the time we think about Facebook and disinformation in the context of the United States or developed countries, and we kind of fail to recognize that there's a much wider reach and there's a much more interesting interaction taking place between political leadership, the access to information by citizens, and the kind of outcomes that result. And I think there's a lot of really interesting work to do to sort of think and understand better what the front lines of this struggle look like. As I kind of think further beyond the book about countries that I'm paying close attention to, and I want to kind of do more work in, countries like India, like Turkey, are places where you're really seeing these sort of hybrid democracies, these weak democracies, where the struggle is occurring, and where a turn to the techniques that I mentioned are increasingly part of the governing strategy of an Erdogan or a Modi when it comes to how they want to implement their politics. And so we have an obligation, I think, as a global community, as a development community, to better understand what these tactics mean and how they interact with the kind of objectives that donors have when they say we want to tackle extreme poverty, we want to bring about sustainability in societies, we want healthy, flourishing societies. Well, having a healthy relationship with digital technology and having a good relationship when it comes to politics is part of that equation, and hopefully will be thought through more deliberately in the coming years.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. This is not a kind of a siloed issue that you can say, well, it's somebody else's issue, I'm going to focus on health or education or ag. You got to know this if you're going to work in any of those areas, if you care about long-term development. I think you made a real contribution. Thanks, Steve, for taking the time to have this discussion today. Thanks for a great book.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Raj. It's always a pleasure. And I look forward to more discussions along these lines.
Thanks. And thanks everyone who's been following along. Look for me and for Steve on Twitter. Let us know what you thought, and look out for the next conversation in my series coming up soon. Thanks so much.